Welcome to Nerd Out at Spotify, where we bring you behind the curtain of the world's most popular audio streaming subscription service. Machine learning, open source, clouds, tabs versus spaces. We'll talk to Spotify engineers about interesting tech issues, big and small. We've already featured a few of Spotify's open source projects on this podcast. Last episode, it was our audio to MIDI converter, Basic Pitch. Before that, we talked about Pedalboard, a Python library for applying audio effects at scale. And then there's Backstage, our most ambitious open source project. A framework for building developer portals, the Backstage platform has been adopted by over 200 companies who use it the way we do here at Spotify, as a single, centralized hub for all of our engineering teams to manage their software components and collaborate with each other. But today, we're not going to talk about any particular project. Instead, we're talking about how we open source projects. We'll discuss the process our engineers go through when they think something they've built is worth sharing with the outside world. Spotify's been using open source for nearly as long as there's been a Spotify. In those 14 years since the first app, the open source ecosystem has changed a lot. What once was just a nerdy corner of the internet is now an essential part of how everyone builds software these days, whether you're an independent developer or the world's biggest tech company. Open source is not just for hobbyists. It's for everyone. If you look at any of our open source projects, you're bound to see the phrase "made with love" at Spotify. That's because open source projects are often passion projects. Usually, a team starts off by making a cool tool to solve a problem they have at Spotify. And then they realize that the tool is cool enough that it's worth sharing with the rest of the world. But it's passion enough to make an open source project good? And more importantly, is that sustainable? Now that open source is so essential to how we all build, it's become more important for us to treat that code more seriously too. We depend on open source code maintained by others, and others depend on open source code maintained by us. So what do you do if you're a company that wants to get more serious about open source? Well, if you're Spotify, you get yourself an OSPO. That stands for Open Source Program Office. And what's an OSPO do exactly? That's a great question, and I have just the person to answer. The person in charge of Spotify's OSPO, Per Ploug, who joins us all the way from Berlin, where he's based. Per, welcome to the podcast.
Hey Dave, my name is Per. I am the open source tech lead at Spotify, which means I lead the open source program office, which is, broadly speaking, responsible for the topic of open source at Spotify.
So tell me a little bit more about that. What is an open source program office? Why does Spotify have one?
Open source at Spotify is an enormously big topic. It goes from anything from like choice of technology into how do we interact with the outside world and even into like HR policies. I think an OSPO can be many things depending on what you need as a company. Some companies drive it as primarily like a compliance function. Some drive it to convince people that open source is a good idea. But none of those things is really what we do at Spotify because we already pretty heavily bought into the idea of open source. We like open source, so there's no convincing to do. So the purpose of the OSPO at Spotify is to make sure that we engage in open source in the right way, in both considering sustainability and also considering what is the purpose of doing open source at Spotify and making sure that our engineers understand the right way of doing it.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like a really big bucket of things. So then what does it mean to lead an OSPO then? What is your day-to-day then?
You could generally say we can divide the OSPO into two things, like what happens inside of a Spotify and what do we tell the outside world about what Spotify does. And these things need to be connected with each other. So of course, inside of Spotify, there is a lot of work to be done to make sure that we publish open source in the right way, make sure that we respect the different licenses, that we make sure that when we actually publish some of our own open source, we take ownership of it. And we make sure that engineers actually have time to do it and they understand why they're doing it and kind of help them direct them in the right direction. Then, of course, there's some compliance topics as well. Make sure we don't overstep any of the obligations in the different licenses like GPL and AGPL. And then you can say there's a cultural aspect to it as well. Like, how do we use open source? For instance, like, should we pay open source projects for the stuff we use? A lot of it is communication. A lot of it is just operational work of making sure that our different repositories is in a reasonable state, that we actually have the data to know what's going on in these repositories to kind of spot if something is being overlooked or not maintained anymore. So yeah, again, it's a lot of different things.
So then you said that you lead this office. So how big of an office is it? What is it that you lead?
It's a tiny office. It's just me. Formally, it's just me. But I work with people like you. I also work with other people in Spotify R&D, and especially in platform. I work with the platform marketing team. I work with legal. So even though we're not in the same office, I am kind of the person responsible for the topic. Going back to the idea of leading an office, there is one person, and that is me, that now is full-time thinking and planning about this topic, whereas as before, it was more something people did next to their job. So my common group of collaborators is like 5-6 people across Spotify.
Yep, that makes sense. I want to come back to that in a second about what happened before. But first, I want to talk to you a little bit about what you did before. So how did you end up here? How did you get to be Spotify's OSPO lead?
So before Spotify, I worked in a company called Zalando. The common comparison is like, it's like Amazon in Europe, but for fashion. And there I also managed the open source topic, also at the same time managing the topic of product security. So I have this like mixed background from there. And then before Zalando, I spent 10 years in a open source startup called Umbraco. We did a open source content management system on the .NET platform. So that went all the way back from when Microsoft said that open source was a really bad idea. And then I was there basically until Microsoft said it was a really good idea to do open source. So that's the evolution there.
That sounds like a lot of open source things, but not necessarily like a typical engineering story where it's like, I don't know, I got a computer science degree, I started coding, I went into coding. So is that typical of an OSPO path, or is there even a typical OSPO path?
I don't think there is. I think there's a lot of different people. The different OSPO people I've met has been everything from engineers who became passionate about open source to lawyers who just took on the open source topic, to also like risk managers and compliance folks who took it on because their company needs to manage the risk of open source. So you have all these different ways into the topic, or either through like a legal background, more like a risk compliance background, or you have true like engineering passion, you can say, for the topic.
Yep.
So no, it's probably not that common.
So you talked a little bit about how OSPOs can be really different. Some are more compliance focused, some are more focused on convincing people to use open source, and how Spotify is really different from that. Can you talk a little bit about what some of those other OSPOs are like now that you've talked a little bit about Spotify and kind of why Spotify is so different?
We can take a couple examples. So I saw the OSPO from Ivan. They are mostly focused on doing like upstream contributions. That's like their primary purpose is to engage in as many upstream contributions as they can. And that kind of makes sense because Ivan do consulting and work with a lot of different open source projects. So they are primarily focused on getting their employees into engaging into other projects to build up knowledge and contribute back to the projects that they work with. And I think a company like Meta, which is a more, you can say, a big tech company who has a lot of like high profile projects, they're very focused on actually making sure they publish all these different things they produce inside of Facebook, or Meta as it's called now. I think the Microsoft OSPO is interesting in a way that I think they've been on this cultural journey of convincing internally into that side of Microsoft, and also the traditional conflict that Microsoft had around open source and licensing and so on. So they kind of also served as a culture barrier inside of Microsoft.
They have very different goals. They're very different organizations. And is there some sort of a place where like OSPO leads get together or talk about these things? Because it sounds like in a lot of ways it could be a lonely job.
Yeah, and it is. I think that's a common thing, is that you're sitting by yourself with this topic. The Linux Foundation has an organization called the To-Do Group, which is basically a congregation of OSPO people. Again, these are like very different people, again, with legal, engineering, or compliance background. But there is a forum that's both with a lot of public information that is just shared on their GitHub repository on like just standard guidelines and practices. And then you can say there's like secret clubhouse for people who are actually like a Linux Foundation member. But yeah, so there is a place where you can actually exchange views and exchange ways to do things and discuss things.
That's really interesting. So like what kind of things go on in the To-Do Group? Like how do you align or connect between these very different OSPOs? Because you talked about them having very different goals and the people having very different backgrounds.
From the outside, you can actually see most of the things that goes on in there because they are all documented in these different issues that's actually created on the different issue trackers. So you can actually see the kind of topics that's actually discussed in there. And it's as different from like, how do you fund an open source project? What would be the common way of doing that? Would you just give people money? Would you like put requirements on them? Would you use GitHub sponsors? Would you just do a bank transfer? What about compliance? How do you convince people to do it? It's all these nitty-gritty details where you start with something that seems fairly simple. Let's give an open source project money. And then the discussion goes into all these little tiny details about that, how that's actually supposed to happen. And then it all of a sudden becomes like a lot more complicated. Like just transferring money from a company in the US into a open source developer's pockets in Belgium is a fairly complicated task when you think about it from like a big corporation perspective. So this is an example, but it's a lot of these things is that in normal corporate life, a lot of these open source topics is quite counterintuitive because you don't have the traditional like IP, you don't have the traditional contract, you don't have a vendor relationship. All these things that businesses are really good at normally is not really there in open source. You have it flipped around. So there's no processes or experiences inside of a corporation to lean on. And I think that's one of the things that the To-Do group is really good at, is to get those experiences from other people where we try to do these bit counterintuitive things in a corporate context and figure out how to do it actually. Oh, some person already did it here, so we can kind of replicate that process over here.
I want to go back to a little bit. You talked about how Spotify's OSPO is very different. You mentioned that you don't focus that much on compliance or on convincing. I think you talked about engaging in open source and sustainability and bringing purpose to a lot of this work. Why is Spotify so different?
I think Spotify has a quite unique culture around their engineering. I think that also impacts how we do open source in the sense that teams are autonomous and they can make their own choices, both in like regards to like technology and so on, and they're trusted with making the right decisions on their own. So you don't have these like centralized decision points or gatekeeping mechanisms inside the company. So that means that if some engineer or some team decides that they want to publish something as open source, historically, there has not been any kind of mechanism to kind of help them make a decision if that's actually a good idea. So we have historically just had a culture of enabling teams and developers. But at the same time, I think with this culture, we get to ask the questions about what is the long-term impact of doing this. Is this an open source project we want to have not just tomorrow, but next year and the year after? What's going to happen in 6 months? What are you going to do when you can't spend your weekends and evenings on this thing anymore? If you have this like informal process and this very informal culture around these things, you don't make the formal decisions that sometimes make a better project. If an engineer goes ahead and just publishes an open source project under the Spotify account, we don't really set any expectations or obligations here. If he or she decides that he wants to spend his time or her time on something else, then she will just do that. But that means that what we put out into the world will just be unmaintained and left to basically just die. And that can in many ways be fine, but at the same time, we do care about these projects and we don't want to leave the potential adopters and users of our projects out there just like with an abandoned project. So that's why we kind of need this more formalized planning to not kind of put something out there that only lasts for 3 months and then the developer who made it just get tired of it and moves on to something else. We kind of need to think about what is the obligations we have when we put something out into the world, and especially when we put it under the Spotify name as well. Because people have a tendency of taking things that comes from Spotify rather than like random developer as more serious.
So I guess one thing we could go a little bit deeper on, I know we talked about kind of passion across the company for open source, but specifically for software engineers, for developers, what do they really get out of open source? Why do they want to participate in these communities and spend like their nights and weekends or all their time on this sort of thing instead of just specifically what their job is?
People have a lot of different motivations, but I think from what I most commonly see is that you learn a lot by actually just putting your code into the world and see what happens. There will be people who actually start using it and they will have opinions. One good saying about open source is build it and people will come with their opinions. So I think as a software engineer, you can learn a lot about how people use your product. There's a lot of things you won't think about when you build things for yourself, when you actually see like people use it, how they actually engage with it, like what is just completely broken and what does not work only on your machine. And there you also learn a lot of good communication skills by just engaging with a much wider audience, which is from very different cultures than yourself. And you also learn a bit of like saying no to features and prioritizing and road mapping and actually owning this as a product. And that's really good skills for engineers to have. And it's a good stepping stone towards like a more senior role that you learn these things, thinking about code, not just this code you throw at the fence, but an actual product that you manage.
Yep. Yeah. So, I mean, I think you listed a lot of the kind of more senior career path engineer things that you might get if you stay within your project and move up on your team. But here it might be kind of a shortcut because you're in a leadership role in a community or you're contributing more, you're getting more users.
Yeah.
And that doesn't have to happen because you moved up within your team or got promoted or whatever. It might be just because you got more active in a community. So then you have all of these different angles from which you're saying that like open source work is work, both from like the individual's point of view, where, I don't know, you don't necessarily do work on your nights and weekends, so you shouldn't have to do open source stuff on nights and weekends.
Yep.
But also from the company's point of view, where like it's still work, it is prioritized like any other thing. And we decide, I don't know, this open source project is more important or less important on the priority than whatever other thing these people can be doing. That, yeah, I really like that phrasing. So then before we go too deep on that, I want to do a little bit of how we even got here. Between the two of us, we can probably cover a lot of the history here. I was really curious, since you're kind of both much deeper in the open source stuff than I am and much newer, what your initial impressions of Spotify's overall OSPO and place in open source is upon arriving. And then I'm happy to fill in a little bit of how we got there. But I wanted to get a more kind of semi-outsider's view from you first before trying to explain why we did the things we did.
I've been here for 8 months now, and it's been a process to kind of realize what is up and down in our, like you could say, our portfolio and the way we deal with it. So I think when I initially got here, I was looking at the numbers and say, wow, we do have a lot of projects. That's quite impressive that we have so much code out in the open, and even some big stuff, some quite popular stuff as well. So things like, wow, we do have a quite large footprint here. And then at some point you realize that, oh, there's some of these things that's not really maintained. People don't really care about them. Then later you figure out, oh, wait a minute, we are actually internally moving away from this thing that we already published as an open source project, but no one really knows, but we do know internally. And we haven't really thought about that someone is actually depending on this thing out in the world. It's like, wow, maybe we should think about a little bit more about this. And then when you start trying to talk to people about these things, like they didn't even know they were responsible for this thing. Oh, that was like a previous team and that doesn't exist anymore. Now we merged in and so on. And I might make it sound like Spotify is a more chaotic place than it really is. But open source is kind of a side gig for a lot of these teams. It's not their primary purpose. So they have their primary business objectives that they're moving towards. So sometimes their open source work just gets left by the wayside and no one really knows who owns it or where it came from or why we even did it. Because like people leave the company or go to different units and so on. So what I've initially thought, well, wow, this is a big footprint, ended up being, oh, this is a lot of loose ends.
Yep. And I think, I don't know, the fact that Spotify is chaotic isn't necessarily like a terribly bad thing. We can admit to it and live with that. But I think those are really good observations and ones that are very clear at this point in time. I think we have a pretty long history of Spotify really loving open source and being fairly passionate about open source, especially in R&D. And from a pretty early stage at the company, getting past a lot of the compliance conversations or the like legal concerns, things like that, to get to the point that we can both consume and create a lot of open source software. But I think the really hard thing for Spotify has been figuring out what to do with that. Like we have people in R&D, especially from fairly new hire engineering ICs all the way up to VP level executives that are really passionate open source and know that Spotify is a great brand and has like a lot of impact in the industry, like you talked about. But we weren't sure how to kind of channel the impact we can have towards open source to have positive open source impact. And there were a lot of initiatives in the company to just build everything we can in the open, as long as it wasn't like a key piece of the product or like a trade secret of some sort. And that led to some of the things you talked about, where we have tons and tons of open source projects, but lots of them either might not be maintained or might not be used internally anymore, because it was like, well, we built all of this in the open, but either moved away from it or realized that now there are a bunch of internal only things that are connected to it. So the thing that's in the open is like a piece of the core, but everything that makes it useful is like 100 additional things that are internal only. And we ended up in a bunch of these kind of funny places. And then also with what you were saying about the internal processes, like prioritization, things like that, we often would end up in places where teams would build what they could, but it wouldn't be the team owning it or the team prioritizing the open source part. It would be, I don't know, our mission is to deliver music to the client as quickly as possible. And thus we created these 3 open source tools, but then realized that only one of them actually gets the music there as quickly as possible. So now we have these 3 things, but we don't want to own them anymore because that experiment wasn't a success for us. So we had all of these kind of different directions of experimentation in open source that were super positive. But when that experimentation doesn't lead to something the company genuinely depends on, that often kind of went by the wayside. So I think a lot of these attempts to build momentum around open source went well, but that didn't result in great open source projects. And then the one thing that I think we did regularly that was, I'll say, successful, but only as successful as this sort of thing can be, is donating money. There were certainly times where we said, like, we should donate to some foundation or some project. And we usually could find the money and do that. And that was a contribution to open source. But it also didn't make us feel great. It was like, well, the point is to contribute, to be part of the community, to create things. It isn't just like, we have some money, here it is. So I think we have this kind of illustrious history of trying really hard to contribute to open source and then not being sure of how. And that put us in exactly the place where you were talking about now, you taking the torch from what we've created for that time to what you're doing now. That state feeds well into a bunch of the work you're doing now. And I think one of the kind of buzzwordy things I've heard you talk about a lot lately is that open source work is work. And you started explaining that a little bit, but without using your own term for it. So I want you to explain what you mean by that and why it's important to you.
Yeah, how do you explain it? Well, we have historically seen open source work as something different than any other kind of work inside of Spotify. We didn't use our normal principles for how we prioritize work. We didn't use the normal way of making sure we have the resources and time to do it. And we also don't really see it as experiments, as you talked about before. And you can say a definition of an experiment is to say, we do a thing, we measure, we learn, and we adapt. That's core principles for a lot of the things that we do inside of Spotify and anything else but open source. At the same time, we need to make sure that there's actually money to do the thing and there's the time to do the thing. And that seems like totally natural for any other kind of project inside of Spotify, that if you want to build a new feature inside of the music player, you need people to do it, you need time to do it, you need money to do it as well. And then you likely also have a limited time experiment where you measure how it's going, you do an A/B test and so on, and then you evaluate if you want to keep doing it. We didn't do any of these things for open source. So that's what I mean by open source work is actually to start moving our way of doing open source into this way of how we do not work normally. So when you launch your new open source project, have an idea about why you're doing it, first of all. Get a clear agreement with your lead about how many hours are you supposed to actually work on this per week? How many engineering hours do we want to put into this maybe for the first 6 months? Do you need money to do it? Do you need any kind of resources like cloud compute and so on? Do you need marketing? A fairly normal consideration. If you build a Spotify feature, you plan a marketing budget as well. And then after those 6 months have passed, let's see how it went. How many people actually use this thing? Did you actually manage to get somewhere with this? And what were the original goals for these 6 months? Is it to build features? Was it to attract people? Was it to get upstream contributions and so on? And then based on those goals, you can evaluate, was this a success? And if it wasn't, then you can either say, we didn't have the time and the resources to do it. We want to double down and do more. Or you can say, this was interesting, fun, and we learned a lot, but we're just going to stop here and just abandon it and tell the users that we have stopped developing this thing, and they can then either fork it or go somewhere else. So yeah, that's what I mean by open source work is work. And I think anyone who is in an engineering organization can probably recognize these normal mechanisms inside of normal engineering, but we didn't apply them to open source before. And that's what we're going to do.
Yep. At least within Spotify, I can't necessarily speak for everywhere else, but certainly a thing that we often don't do. I mean, when we're building a new feature and we do some amount of A/B testing or we evaluate product market fit, we certainly do that as we continue to ramp up investment, or with some features, ramp down investment. But with open source, it was a lot of this, build everything in the open, or this is an awesome thing we should try. But then there weren't necessarily success metrics or a real cadence on which we would evaluate success. And we would determine, do we invest more? Do we invest less? I think it's really interesting that you mentioned things like marketing. So I think we mentioned this on one of the Backstage episodes, but there was a really early point in Backstage open source where we were talking to people outside the company, and there was one person whose opinion we really valued that said that he thought that Backstage was going to be a success and do really well. And we asked what the thing that made him feel that way was. And I think his initial response was the animated logo on our GitHub page. And to all of us, that was a ridiculous thing to base success on. But effectively what he was saying was what you just said. This isn't just somebody that took a pile of code and threw it out there. Because you went as far as having someone that spent some time to create a logo and animate it and put it here and make the things match their colors, as opposed to just here's some JavaScript, it's on GitHub, which is very much what we used to do.
Maybe also say that the bar is not that insanely high. It's not to make it impossible to do open source at Spotify. It doesn't need to be more than that. But sometimes it's like thinking about like, where do you actually want to go with this thing and why are you doing it? We don't need every future Spotify project to be at the backstage level of engagement and seriousness here. We can also just have experiments that we still think about what we do and then we just consider it experiment. Like Pedalboard is one of my favorite examples of this Python library to modify sound. And I think that has been really well received, and there's a lot of contributors and a lot of adoption of this library. But I don't think anyone really considered that to be anything serious, and it became like a unexpected success, which is really great. So we should have room for both ends of the scale, saying it shouldn't just be things that has like a big potential commercial success thing. It can also just be things that we think is a fun experiment. That's also totally fine.
Yep. The thing that immediately makes me think is, but when we open source Backstage, it was an experiment. We weren't necessarily sure it was going to be any more successful than we initially thought Pedalboard would be. So I think the interesting question there is, how do you know or like plan for things that could be one or the other? Because I think it would be crazy to say like, well, this one is going to be super successful. So from day one, we're putting 100 people on it, and this one is not.
I think the truth is you don't know from the beginning, and you kind of have to wait and see. I saw a piece of statistic at some point that says like 2% of all open source projects kind of succeed. I don't know what the definition of success is, but like 2% is a pretty low number, which gives you a lot of room to just experiment. Like the bar is not very high. Just put it out there and see what happens. But do it in like a responsible way, and then make a decision once your experimentation time runs out. And you also have to kind of have mechanisms in place that's saying that the maintainer of this thing can actually tell someone in the organization that we are actually seeing like a pretty big adoption here. We didn't expect this, and now I kind of need help, or we need to give it to someone who can actually give it the love it deserves.
I think the other thing that we've talked a lot about is just open source sustainability and internally. Like, I think a good chunk of your conversations about open source work being work aren't just about structuring the open source projects and metrics and some of the things we talked about, but like making this work for the engineers and people that are working on this and might be passionate about it, but also have jobs at Spotify and have to do things that get audio to people's devices. Talk to me a little bit about your thoughts in that space and what you're trying to do at Spotify to make the things easier for those people and to make that balance work.
I think that thinking comes from a statistic that we looked at, like when does actual open source work happen inside of Spotify? Like when do people actually commit code? And we see that a lot of code is committed to open source repositories by employees after working hours are done or in weekends. And I think we are at like 50-50 at least on what is work time and what is like non-work time contributions here. And that tells me that people don't really have the dedicated time to do this. Their everyday job is naturally taking up a lot of their time. So one thing we can do here is like all the new projects we set up now is that they have a dedicated number put on them by the engineer or the engineers who are publishing them. And in collaboration with the lead, they decide like how many hours are we going to dedicate to this thing. So this piece of time cannot be overtaken by the normal day-to-day work on this, so that you can actually do it in your work time. And I think this is important because we don't want to have open source to be exclusively for people who have time in the evenings and the weekends. We also do want to have this as something we support as an employer, because again, they are publishing this under the Spotify name. So we as an employer have an obligation here to make sure that our employees equally have access to do open source. And that's not just people who can do it in the evenings and weekends, but also people with families and who don't want to code JavaScript in the weekend, which is a very specific kind of person who want to do that.
Yeah, oddly enough, it's not everyone. The flip side of that argument is that at some point, maybe the investment isn't worth it for the company. Yeah. So then what do we do?
See, I think I really like that argument, and I like that because it means that if everyone respects that argumentation and we put people's passions aside, then our investments will kind of regulate themselves, in the sense that if we're forced to dedicate company time in open source projects, then we will only dedicate hours to things we actually find important. And so it kind of forces us as an organization to think about what is actually important, what actually gives us value. So we don't see it as a perk that we give to our employees, like, you can go play tennis for free and you can do open source as kind of these like classic engineering perks, but actually more think about it as open source work being work. That we think about this, open source work can be something that's valuable for the company. We can think it into our different business opportunities, saying that by doing this library here in the open, we get this set of values out of it again. And I like that idea much better than that we think about it as a perk, because if there's one thing that can go away unexpectedly, it is these things that's considered perks or hobbies. Even though it might be harder to convince people to see it as a valuable thing to do, then it's something that actually stays around and have longevity rather than a fun hobby.
So then, how are we doing with this? I mean, you've kind of poked around this a bunch. You said you've been here for about 8 months. Have you fixed everything yet?
No, not at all. We are in this mode of doing cleanup right now. So we are archiving a lot of projects, just bringing our number of projects down to the actual active projects. That's first. That's step one. Step two is to actually make sure we find the teams who own these projects and make sure they commit to actually being owners. If they don't want to own them anymore, if the thing's not relevant for them anymore, we will archive them or give them to someone else who can actually maintain them. And then alongside this, we are collecting the data and the metrics that actually enables us to make some of these decisions. Because when I say it might sound easy. Yeah, let's just figure out what's popular and what we spend our time on and so on. But that's not as easy as you might think. We now are in a place where we have an internal dashboard where we can at least see how much work is happening on these individual open source projects. We can see a metric that now, what is the percentage of work versus non-work is on these projects. And then we can start approaching the owners once we know them and actually have that conversation saying, hey, I think you should either prioritize time here or maybe decide that you don't want to be an open source maintainer, because this is clearly something that is a person's hobby and not a job right now. We are moving towards having a smaller set of projects that's well maintained, where we know the owners, so we can have these discussions and conversations about where do we actually want to go with this.
Yep, that's really interesting, because I guess one of the things you said was your first impression of Spotify was check out all these projects. And now you're saying actually the way to make this healthy is to stop having so many projects, but have projects that are in a good state and a good level of activity.
Yeah, and I think number of projects is really this vanity metric of you can go out and say, yes, we have 370 projects. But in reality, we might only have 30 that's actually well maintained. But that's a much better place to be. Having 30 good ones is much better than having 370 that's not really maintained.
Yeah. So you called it a vanity metric. Do you have solid metrics? Do you have thoughts on metrics that you could use to evaluate overall health and sustainability of a company's open source that aren't vanity metrics, like number of projects?
So there's a set of metrics that we kind of use internally now. And we look at each individual project, and there's a set. So let's take the most straightforward ones first. Let's just look at if a project has open security vulnerabilities that's older than X number of days. That's a very clear metric that they maintain, because we get emails from GitHub about every security vulnerability. And if no one is reacting to these, then there's clearly no one watching what's going on here. But we also look at number of pull requests and number of issues that's been open without any response for a number of days. What is the response time here on the maintainer's part in regards to a project? Do they have a lot of open pull requests? Do the people who actually take their time to contribute code back even get a response? If not, that's not a very good experience, and probably an indicator, again, that no one is really watching after this thing. Then we also look at maintainers, both internally and externally, because we do have projects that's maintained by external contributors, former employees, external people, and so on, and then versus the number of internal people. And we would like to have a good spread there. We would like that it's not only us actually driving these projects forward, but again, we don't want it's only external people doing it. And then in the end, we look at what is the current activity, how many commits do we see? Do we see them in actual work time and so on? What's the distribution and so on? That's the straightforward metrics we have. And that boils down to this, you can say, quality metric we have on our projects, saying that we need to be good or green in all these areas to consider this a quality, well-maintained project.
So then you have these per project, and then there's some metric of how many of your projects are green, kind of aggregate. That makes sense. The other interesting thing you said was you said something about give them to someone else that can maintain them, when referring to projects that either we are not using anymore or maybe aren't in a great state from us. Or I think the ones you just mentioned where there is an external maintainer or it is kind of someone that left the company, those make sense. But what does that look like for other projects? I imagine there isn't an obvious answer every time we need to give a project to someone else that can maintain it.
No, definitely not. And then if there's no straightforward answer, is that sometimes it's just to announce that you're archiving it and putting it in not really maintained mode. If we look at how we deal with this internally, again, the priority would be to say, let's find an internal owner that actually has an interest in owning this, because we still need it internally. If we don't need it internally and no one really maintains it, let's see if there's an obvious external user here. That might be the former employee who started the project at Spotify. They might want to take it over. It might be other companies who have some sort of interest in it. We can look at the dependents of the project and see, is there any of these people we can approach? Or just look at, we also have a dashboard that says like, who are the most common contributor to a given project? And then we can see if any one of these like sticks out. And if there's no one obvious, or we don't really get a response, which is that happens, then the obvious path forward is to archive it and then see what happens. It's not like the code is being deleted. Anyone can fork it and move on with it. And I think that's the right mechanism. Again, be clear about where the project is, like what's the state, and then archive it if it's dead.
Yep. There's really this piece of being super clear about where things are. So it's not that you just have github.com/Spotify and there are a couple hundred things there, and some of them are super actively worked on every day by squads, and some of them no one's touched in months or years. And they all kind of look the same at first glance. It sounds like a lot of this work, a lot of this making it sustainable work is about something like marking the green ones green and everything else as something else, so that at least people don't trip over this and say, this thing looks amazing, I'm going to start using it, and realize that no one's touched it in years, and it might not be as amazing as you think, or you mentioned security vulnerabilities or all the other metrics. Who knows what state they're in unless it gets some kind of like the Spotify OSPO stamp of approval.
Yeah, and I don't want to be the stamp of approval, but but yeah, then we can see that there are these projects now that doesn't live up to any kind of, you would say, would be a quality, well-maintained project. And yeah, as you say, it's very hard to determine that from the outside. If you adopt something in, it's like you don't notice if something is out of sync here, that you don't see like a monthly release, and you don't, So it's hard to actually detect as a user or a consumer of this open source project that, wait, no one is actually maintaining this thing.
So you've mentioned a few times this open source dashboard that has these metrics and has a way for seeing ownership. Tell me a little bit more about that. Kind of what is it? How did it come to be?
So one of the first things I did when I joined here was to make a big spreadsheet. And I pulled in all these metrics from GitHub, and I just kept pulling them in. And I had this like very colorful spreadsheet of the state of these projects, where people could then like add comments in there to say, hey, we actually do use this, or hey, it's actually us who owns it, and so on. And I think after like a month of doing the spreadsheet, I was like, I am so done with spreadsheets. But the data in there is like super valuable. But the problem is that it was really only me who looked at it. So it didn't have this mechanism of involving anyone else in the organization. So that's kind of where this dashboard comes out of. Right now, it's an internal-only plugin for Backstage. So we would probably call it the Open Source Hub. And there you can go see all the different projects. So you can see the names, the description, all the different like metrics we want to assign to them is available on these project pages. And you can see the owner. So anyone can go find a project and figure out like, who actually owns this thing. The idea is that we will also eventually open source this plugin so that other companies can use it as well as part of their Backstage usage.
How did this thing go from you have this spreadsheet, you're sick of working in the spreadsheet, to now there is a Backstage plugin that we use internally? Let's start with the process of actually creating it. Is there some group that put it together?
I'm one of the people who have been like fortunate enough to do a lot of JavaScript in my time. Then that is actually amazingly straightforward to build a plugin for Backstage. It's using React, it's using TypeScript, and it's straightforward to build something. You can kind of get going rather quickly.
Yeah, so then tell me about the last thing you said about it. You said that the idea is for it to be open source. Why isn't it open source already?
Well, I think one of them is that I'm the only person working on it. So I don't want to put it out there before we actually get more people than just me doing it. And then there's other things as well, like packaging this, like writing docs, making sure this can actually easily be installed, make sure you have a Docker image and all those things. And that hasn't really been needed so far by running it internally. So it's essentially just, I'm not ready to release it, and I can't really do it in a responsible way right now. So in that way, I am living after my own principles.
Yep, no, that makes sense. I just think there's a really, maybe like ironic kind of meta conversation here about the fact that you have this great internal Backstage tool that would be useful if open source, probably useful to other companies. Yeah. But by a lot of the same kind of open source work is work principles. Either you're the kind of lone passionate person putting it together and possibly spending nights and weekends on it, and it's not prioritized the normal way, or maybe you are living up to all of your own principles and it is prioritized highly enough in the OSPO that it should be using some of your time, but not quite enough of your time to be truly like open source release used by other people already. There's definitely something here about you creating these principles, but still having a project that wants to be open source and can't be there.
That is both like fortunate and unfortunate at the same time. I think it's part of the condition of working at a company where you have this ever-present conflict between open source and you can say like normal work. And we are not there yet. We haven't created like a perfect model at all here, and it's not even functioning. It's a set of principles and beliefs right now. And so it's hard to fix because it's basically having two conflicting priorities for the same person. And it's not easy to solve. And even here, like the open source team can't release open source code because they don't really have the resources to do it. That's a good sign of how complicated it actually is. I think it's complicated at most companies, unless the team works on something whereas this is actually the core thing they do, and then they release it as open source, that core thing they're building. So you can say there's no conflicts. It's just an overlap between the things they're actually building and just also releasing it as open source.
Yep. Now, that makes a lot of sense, but still puts me in like a funny, like ironic meta place in thinking about it. You talked a little bit about funding earlier in some of the open source work is work conversations. And I think there are a couple of things that you've been involved in recently that try to make it easier for people that are working in open source to be well compensated for that work. And I want to talk like a little bit about it because I think we're going to talk more on a future episode, but let's get a quick tease for what we're going to cover and why it's interesting.
Yeah, we established a FUS fund with a budget of 100,000 euros as an experiment to see, can we have substantial impact on the projects we depend on? And by that, I mean, give projects money so that they actually have the time to maintain these projects, so they don't end up doing evenings and weekends as we want to avoid for our employees. We do also want to avoid that for the third-party maintainers that we depend on. We don't want people to burn out or get sick and tired of maintaining a project. Trying to help them go home from work at 4 instead of doing evenings and weekends maintaining this open source project. Because we think that's the sustainable way of doing any kind of work. If you work 80 to 100 hours a week, you will burn out at some point. And if a project we depend on in thousands of applications across Spotify, if that maintainer burns out and just say, I am never going to do open source again, then we are also screwed. We have an interest here as well. It's not just to like make the world a better place. It is also to make sure that the things we depend on actually stays there.
If everyone did this, then maybe we could put the well back and well compensated. But while there are just a handful of companies, and I can't pretend that Spotify is the only one, but if there's just a handful of companies, then of course the numbers aren't high enough for me to confidently put the word well in there like I did when I asked. The other thing that I wanted to get a quick thought from you was with Backstage, we have the largest community we've managed to create around open source. And we've talked a little bit there about trying to make it a community where people don't just contribute and work on the project, but can make a living or make some sort of compensation working within that community. Can you talk a little bit about how that really helps the community be stronger? Because I think there's a flip side of it, which is now we've taken it from open source to just making money. But why is that a good thing from like a OSPO open source point of view, as opposed to just a like people being able to make money point of view?
It's always interesting when the conversation hits about open source and money. People always get kind of queasy and uncomfortable. It's like open source has to be a passion and there has to be a lot of suffering. I think it helps the ecosystem at large that we as a company shows that, hey, we are creating an open source project here, but we are also creating revenue streams, both for ourselves, but also for other companies or individuals, to show that you can actually produce open source that everyone can use under these good conditions, the licensing conditions, and still make money. And making money isn't just for the sake of making money. It's when you think longer term, a company that can make more money than it spends, that is a company that will be around for a long time and just be a 3-month experiment, but actually be something where, oh, I can actually use this product and there will actually be someone picking up the phone or answering the email or helping me if the software doesn't work or offer me other commercial services that I as a company need. And that should be a comfort. Making a commercial model that works ensures that the software will also stay healthy and maintained, and we can keep investing in it because we will make money to pay engineers to work on it full time.
I think that's a great way of reframing the conversation around making money on open source not being a great evil. It both tries to eliminate the stigma to make it be all about kind of like you said, you haven't suffered enough to have open source street cred, but also makes it possible for this thing to be truly sustainable because you don't have to continuously suffer. And thus maybe, I don't know, 20 years down the road, from 20 years of suffering, you won't want to leave because it will have been 20 years of sustainable operation instead of just suffering. So
yeah. And I would love that we, in the open source community at large, saw that as a success, that, oh, this open source project actually became a company, rather than, oh, this was bought by a big tech company. Because that seems like the success metric for an open source company now is that some older tech company bought it. And I would wish that we just more thought about, oh, this became a sustainable business. That would be great.
Yep. Cool. Well, yeah, thanks for spending this time with us. This has been a lot of fun.
Likewise. Thank you, Dave.
What other things do you nerd out about?
I am a person who has like 1,000 different hobbies, and I don't really ever get good at them, but I like the process. So I have, like, next to me, I have a synthesizer and a drum machine I play around in. I fiddle around with like Soundtrap every once in a while. I like that part. I try to get good at skateboarding at some point. I play a lot of Fortnite and Magic cards with my son, so it's all over there. But I don't have a thing that I just deeply engage in. I just have a lot of things that I'm slightly crappy at.
Thanks for listening to Nerd Out at Spotify. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to hit that follow button. Next episode, we'll talk about how we use automation at scale to reduce toil and trouble for our developers, improving the quality of our software and the everyday experience of our dev teams at the same time. Hear how fleet management does all the parts of maintaining software that you'd rather not do. Nerd Out at Spotify is produced by Spotify's Ted Vergakis and by Seaplane Armada, who also wrote our superb theme song. I'm Dave Zolotusky. Thanks for nerding out with us.